Once upon a time, there were only movies, television, and books to entertain the masses, until now.
When you're actually able to have control and manipulate this virtual world in front of you, it just feels good.
Yet video games strive for something beyond control, the perfect story.
Here's the situation. Another member of the science team's gone missing.
I think there isn't a game that wouldn't be made better by a good story and good characters.
Sonny, they shot my father. Maybe there's an opportunity to combine storytelling with the I dive in and make choices, which is what defines games.
But there is still one vital story element to come: emotion.
Can a computer game make you cry? Once you've answered that question in the affirmative, then I think that there's no reason for everybody not to be playing video games.
The golden age of arcade games peaked at the end of the 1970s and early 1980s, with pellet-popping Pac-Men and unidentified alien invaders. Video games allowed the players to control their own digital experience. But if this new form of entertainment was going to last, game designers knew they needed what TV and movies already had: a story.
I think at the very beginning with video games, what you had with a lot of them was a very simple technical mechanic like Pong, where, okay, I'm rotating this dial and it's moving a paddle and here comes this ball and there's a little bit of physics involved. But it's not really about anything. It's just an amusement.
In order to keep players entertained, game designers learned from filmmakers that they had to connect with the player on a deeper level.
So for games to get from the level of just being a fun activity, kind of like Pong, to a true entertainment that is competitive with film and book and so on, then games have to cross the threshold and also touch us in the ways that story does, with an emotional response, with characters we actually can care about and get involved with.
In the late 1970s, a breakthrough film took the action movie to new heights by infusing a sci-fi battle with a dramatic story.
Use the Force, Luke.
Led by a Jedi hero. Luke Skywalker's journey was a call to greatness and a chance for one man to effect great change.
Taking your first step into a larger world.
A motif many know. George Lucas learned from Joseph Campbell's classic text, The Hero with 1,000 Faces.
Star Wars really showed off that kind of storytelling with a kind of a fast-paced panache, really, with all this great technology and all these great special effects that didn't detract from the story. And the influence can still be felt in video games.
The mind-blowing special effects in Star Wars drew people into the movie theaters.
You don't believe in the Force, do you?
But in the video game world, games were still nothing more than idle play toys. There were space games like Asteroids and Space Invaders, but they didn't have characters or stories. At least, not yet.
And when Star Wars was igniting theater screens all over the world, gaming was really in its infancy. And so I think the video game industry really was struggling with making these games work in the first place, exploring how to use controls in video games. And, you know, at the time, story just wasn't something you put into your games.
So video games had to learn from movies that good stories combined with exciting action put people in their seats and eventually behind their joysticks.
To me, it's more interesting if there's an epic storyline and I'm a hero and I'm on, Joseph Campbell's, heroic quest.
To be a storytelling medium, we've got to have characters, and if we're going to care about the characters, we've got to care about emotion.
In the future, we will be a mass market form of entertainment. And we will have the ability to delight and entertain customers who have all sorts of different kinds of tastes, much like television does today, much like books do today, music or movies. It's no different than any other creative medium, in my opinion, and the very best artists will figure out how to make you cry.
Thank you! But to create emotion in video games, programmers would first have to learn how to turn pixels and plumbers into new video game heroes. After millions of people around the world followed Luke Skywalker's heroic journey in Star Wars, video games realized that perhaps they too needed a hero. But the lack of processing power really limited game designers as to how far they could develop a character's look, let alone their story. It would take the imagination of an artist and a fledgling company to turn video games into something more than a toy. Before the Japanese company Nintendo broke into video games, they produced everything from plastic toys to playing cards. In the 1970s, the century-old company based in Kyoto dabbled in the video game business by distributing the Magnavox Odyssey in Japan. However, in order to establish themselves as a real player in the growing arcade market, the CEO of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, sent his son-in-law, Minoru Arakawa, to the United States to create Nintendo of America.
Mr. Arakawa said, okay, Radar Scope is going to be our Space Invaders, it's going to be our Pac-Man, it's going to be our big hit product. I'm going to order 3,000 of these from the Japanese offices. Before those 3,000 games get there, the test unit that they had set up at an American bar called the Spot Tavern in Seattle starts making less and less and less money. Then he realizes, oh no, I'm going to have all these Radar Scope games sitting around useless. What am I going to do?
Stuck with an expensive inventory of the failed product, Nintendo of America needed a smash hit game that the unsold machines could be converted to play.
So all they needed to do was swap out a couple little pieces of paper, put in another game, and they had a totally new video game. What ends up happening is Yamauchi has no game designers. They're all working on other projects. And so he says, okay, well, we've got this guy named Miyamoto, and he went to him and said, design us a video game.
Miyamoto was hired as an artist by Yamauchi, a friend of his father's, in 1977. Since he wasn't a programmer by trade, Miyamoto was more interested in telling little stories in his video games.
A lot of the early people in the game industry are essentially technologists. They were tinkerers who now had computers to tinker on rather than, a train set. But Miyamoto was an artist. He wanted to be a puppeteer. He wanted to be an entertainer of some kind.
Shigeru Miyamoto had a vision of a game that was fun to play.
He was really trying to recreate that feeling of delight and wonderment and excitement that he had as a child exploring the world.
He was also inspired by anime and manga that made his character design distinctly Japanese.
Japanese anime, comic, manga, all are very different from US European taste. Japanese people grew up in the environment where many childish, adorable characters were seen, and it's been 40 years. Manga and anime have affected the Japanese a lot. It's one of our key cultural components. I think our desire for these entertainments like video games and manga and our immature tendencies have been somehow pre-programmed within ourselves. This is something that people innately want. To grow up as a child and have someone take care of us and not wanting to die, that is our utmost desire in life, I think. Our seeking of childish and the somewhat unconscious freedom may be the reason why such culture has flourished here.
Without advanced technology and without any programming experience, Miyamoto did the impossible.
I had an idea for a main character who was not really stunning, cool, or good-looking like Superman. Because characters in video games have to fit on a small screen. The design had to be less complicated.
Miyamoto turned a portly plumber called Jumpman into a superstar. Later on, when Donkey Kong was released in 1981, Miyamoto's protagonist was renamed Mario.
It was the first time it really was the most fleshed out character. The idea that a video game should not just be about Armageddon's coming and you have to shoot this down or defend yourself about this, but it actually is about a character and there's a sort of moral imperative that you have to save your girlfriend from this nasty gorilla.
Well, if you go back to kind of American gaming in the 70s, a lot of the games didn't have a central character. It was a square block, and you kind of had to imagine that that white blinking dot is a tennis racket, or a guy, or, you know, a boat or a car. The medium was so limited. It was so hard to build a character that was recognizable.
And so Mario could only be a certain size. So Mario has a really big nose because it's easy to see a nose on somebody's face. Mario has a mustache because there weren't enough pixels to define a mouth underneath that nose. He wears a hat because it's really difficult to do hairstyles in an old arcade game like that.
The red suit that Jumpman wore, that was a trick that the engineers at Nintendo taught him, that if you want one character to be recognized on the screen, put him in this crazy color. So he had to learn all of those things, but he brought with him the imagination of an artist and the way of storytelling that an artist would bring. And that was something very, very, very important to the industry, especially at that time.
When we made Mario, we only had 3 members, myself, the programmer, and the designer. We actually drew pictures of characters on dotted sheets of paper to see how it moved. Like when Mario's running, but turning around all of a sudden, there'd be a sound of slipping, like a braking sound.
Miyamoto also turned a few computer beeps into a distinctive soundtrack that supported Donkey Kong's fun and innocent gameplay. Nintendo had its first hit, and Mario would soon grow to be more recognizable than Mickey Mouse. Miyamoto turned moving pixels into Mario, every man's hero, who not only saved the princess, but also helped save the home video game business.
It's a whole new playing field for the nation's Nintendo-holics.
There was a sense in the US that home video games were dead, that the fad of the video game console was over. The companies all believed that the future was in personal computers. Atari was convinced. They took all Atari 2600, 7800, all that stuff off the market. They devoted the entire company's resources to making personal computers.
With pure gaming consoles like the Atari 2600 off the market, the trend was to design games for the emerging personal computer business. However, the industry wasn't going to die. Games just had to get better.
Nintendo started to bring it back, and they brought it back in the form what they called a toy, something designed and aimed at kids and family.
Nintendo created their own home video game console and released it in Japan as the Famicom.
The Nintendo Entertainment System was originally called Famicom for the family, and when the marketers came to bring it into the US, they realized they couldn't call it the Famicom because families don't play together. They changed the name to the Nintendo Entertainment System to introduce it to America because they realized that the word family had negative connotations when associated with entertainment in this country.
It was an uphill battle, but after a lot of convincing, toy store owners who were burned by the video game crash took a risk with Nintendo and put its console on their shelves in 1985.
What we've done in the last 3.5 years is to single-handedly recreate a dead industry.
Nintendo also bundled Miyamoto's newest game, Super Mario Bros., with the Nintendo Entertainment System. The combination proved to be a winner.
Super Mario Brothers basically took the unknown character from Donkey Kong, gave him a brother, and gave him a real purpose. So you would start at the left side of a level, and you always knew the end of the level is on the right, so you kind of forge forward the whole time. And you saw this whole world unfold as you're progressing through it. And just like in a narrative, you had the beginning of a level, and the end you would get your chance at rescuing the princess.
It really was Nintendo and the work of Shigeru Miyamoto, which the Super Mario Brothers, which was bundled with the Nintendo Entertainment System that reinvigorated the industry. If there had not been a Mario Brothers, if there had not been somebody who'd sort of had the vision to take video games to a new level where story was involved, it really might have gone the way of the hula hoop.
Super Mario Bros. Was a best-selling game worldwide, and more importantly, it also ushered in the new home video game revolution.
What will the future bring from Nintendo?
The success of Super Mario Bros. And Nintendo marked the birth of characters and narrative in video games. While players entered the world of Mario, Shigeru Miyamoto was already envisioning another imaginative game world his players could explore and discover. A world reminiscent of his childhood in the hillsides near Kyoto.
And he would go out exploring, and there was a system of caves, apparently, near where he lived, and so he one day brought a lantern and would go through the caves and explore different passageways and map them out. And so later on in life, when the technology became powerful enough, he immediately said, you know, I want to make a game that's like that about exploring.
Many years ago, Prince Darkness Ganon stole one of the Triforce with power.
With games like Donkey Kong, Mario at the end, Mario at the beginning is the same Mario. He has all the same powers. Same thing with Super Mario Brothers. With Zelda, Link at the beginning is weak. He only has a certain amount of life energy. He has no weaponry at all. He has nothing. And at the end of Zelda, he has this array of weapons. He has all this life energy. And so that wasn't unique to The Legend of Zelda. Role-playing games had been around long before that. But it was the first game that married that really successfully with action.
These are epic stories with classic themes of good and bad. The protagonist has to rescue somebody. You're a boy who has to go out and be brave and be better than you are when you start, in order, not just for your own good, but for the betterment of your community.
Intricate gameplay accompanied by a dramatic musical score in Legend of Zelda gave the player a world and a video game character they could empathize with for the first time.
Legend of Zelda is a game that you will always hear people say it was the first game that they ever cried when they played a game. It was very story-based. Your ability to really feel for the main character and for what he had to go through in order to better himself is something that really touched a lot of people.
Legend of Zelda, which was released in 1987, became widely popular in Europe, Japan, and North America. Following a character as he leveled up and gained more power by finding hidden treasures became significant for a generation of people who were starting to focus more on themselves.
The 80s was definitely, I think, the final throwing off of any delusions about, revolutionizing the establishment. The counterculture hippies now were the establishment, and they embraced the toys of the establishment wholeheartedly. More money was, often a goal in a game.
As the Cold War thawed in the mid to late 80s, tensions between superpowers started to wane. Reaganomics and Thatcherism lowered income taxes and spurred a decade of consumerism.
The video games themselves were a toy of aspiration.
I'm a video game addict. This is big business.
It became sort of one of the things that, as a new 80s adult, it was okay to go spend a lot of money on a video game console or on a computer to play games on, which was not something that previous generations would have embraced. My father, as an accountant, would not have bought a computer to play games on. He would have bought a computer to do spreadsheets on.
Today, IBM made it official after months of hints and leaks to the press. The Goliath of computers is coming out with its first home computer. It's called the PC Junior, unofficially the Peanut.
Computer games were unheard of because most people didn't have computers. Very, 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 very few people had computers, and most computers were in offices. They were the huge, big IBM mainframes. And basically, the games were text. So the idea of actually putting pictures was not only innovative, but how do you do it?
From their home in Southern California, Roberta and Ken Williams started Sierra Online. With limited technology, they brought graphics and stories to the first computer games.
When we started Sierra, the industry was just getting born. I mean, there was the very, very first personal computers. The Radio Shack had just introduced the TRS-80. Apple was out, and it really was hard. I mean, it was a pretty gutless machine. By now, I'm sure most joysticks have more computing power than the first computers.
In 1980, Roberta and Ken created Mystery House. It had no sound, no color, no animation, but it did have one feature that no other computer game had at the time: graphics. Packaged in Ziploc bags, Ken sold it to local software shops. To their surprise, it quickly became a bestseller and sold more than 10,000 copies, which was a record-breaking phenomenon for the time, considering the limited number of personal computers sold. Mystery House was selling on a virtual one-to-one basis with home computers.
For some reason, people who played games on their computers were of a different mindset than people who buy video game machines. They were more patient, so the idea of playing a game that would challenge you, to think about solving a puzzle that was going to take a while to unfold wasn't something strange or weird to them.
Even as home video consoles were flailing in '83, Ken and Roberta were gaining ground in the budding PC game market. Their next graphical adventure was King's Quest. At a time when a mouse and sound card were unheard of, the game featured never-before-seen 3D-like worlds and sound with characters the player controlled.
If you look at our early games, they're comical because they're checkerboarded, by taking all of the different limitations into account and putting dots in the right places. Like you give something that if you squinted and stood way back from the screen, kind of looked like color. And kind of blew people away, and that people were willing to tolerate such bad graphics, such bad sound, showed that there was an industry there, but it had yet to be born.
Well, in the beginning, a lot of the Heroes Quest games were very focused on action. With some of the games like King's Quest, that action element really got thrown out in favor of exploration and kind of using your mind more to overcome hurdles. And also, it was a departure in that you didn't control the character directly. You're kind of an onlooker, and the character does your bidding, but you're not completely connected to it. And so, not only was the story more intricate, because of the slower pacing, you were able to tell more, you had more text in those games, but also the puzzles were much deeper.
Although Miyamoto's console games were very different from the Williams computer games, their ability to combine traditional storytelling techniques with new technology was very similar. They took games and players where no one thought they could, but changing times and changing tastes of a new generation of gamers would soon push storytelling and technology to a new edge. Artists like Shigeru Miyamoto and Roberta Williams brought video games to life with their rich storylines, characters, and environments. With just a few pixels and sound beats to choose from, they created immersive worlds where each player was crowned a hero. Playing the hero in Super Mario Bros. Was fun, but by the early 1990s, gamers grew up and they wanted entertainment that reflected their new, mature selves. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the decade was marked by a new economic and cultural globalization. Suddenly, a new generation of gamers who grew up with only a handful of TV channels now had dozens of channels on their cable connection. And with their new personal computers at home, gamers were also connecting to the internet, able to access information from around the world in seconds.
By sort of the late 80s, early 90s, you were starting to see home consoles that were as powerful as what you were finding in an arcade. Now you were getting them in a little box. So people were starting to say the amount of technology that was needed to launch the space shuttle you could now get in your home computer.
For many, the hero's journey was over. Players traded their crowns in for spiky hair, fast cars, and faster women. The video game anti-heroes emerged, and the older players loved them.
Well, I think what a lot of people didn't realize is that as the so-called Nintendo generation grew up, they continued to want to play games. The way somebody a little bit older watched TV or movies when they were a kid, when they got older, they still wanted to watch TV or movies, they just wanted adult fare.
A game company called Sega Enterprises delivered just that. Similar to Nintendo, Sega was a toy company that came out with arcade hits like Frogger in the 70s, and later with a console called the Sega Master System in the 80s. By marketing in regions where Nintendo didn't, the console sold exceptionally well in Europe and Brazil. But in 1983, Sega was hit hard by the video game crash.
The manufacturers are still trying, those who haven't gone bankrupt, but the experts who follow the industry say it probably won't make a big comeback, that the game players have simply moved on to other things like video cassettes, records, tapes, even the movies.
Little did they know, the video game business wasn't ready to die. Sega never gave up. Instead, it re-entered the recovering video game market and put out the Sega Mega Drive in Japan, a 16-bit console to rival Nintendo's 8-bit Famicom. With double the processing power, Sega's system could handle superior sound and graphics.
Back on 8-bit, you could do really simple Donkey Kong, Pong, things like that. When you got to 16-bit, now you can cover a much wider range of topics. You can have team sports, you can have really good adventure games with storylines. You could do much better versions in all the different genres.
This new technology arrived just in time. When the original Pong-playing gamers grew up and had to go to work, game companies had to attract the younger Mario-playing generation of gamers, who were now young men in their late teens and early 20s. When the Sega Mega Drive was shipped to the US, it was renamed the Sega Genesis. And to attract this slightly older buyer, the console was bundled with a fast-flying anthropomorphic hedgehog.
If Mario was cute and gee and aw shucks, then Sonic the Hedgehog was liable to flip you the bird kind of a character that started to resonate with the angsty teens of the early 1990s. And so as they grew up, Sonic was more relevant a character to them.
In the early 90s, Nintendo was still the dominant force. And we look back, and of course driven by the cute little Italian plumber called Mario. But I think Sega identified that the consumer was looking for something else. In particular, with the launch of the Sega Genesis console, there was more processing power now that allowed characters, instead of jumping off mushrooms and bouncing and having this side-scrolling effect, you had the ability now to deliver speed.
Sonic was about, mobility and getting around, and I think the spikiness of the haircut or the bristles on the hedgehog just reinforced that.
Sega was looking at delivering an irreverent character that tied into the more impish sense of mischief that teenage boys would have. Sonic was the perfect character.
He is an anti-hero in that sense, and that he's not meant to really embody heroic qualities. There's a kind of selfishness to him. But that's also what makes him fun.
In some cases, the least noble characters were the most funny, and therefore most fun to play. Before Sonic spun onto TV screens, there was another anti-hero who strutted straight into the hearts of thousands of adult adventure players. Larry Laffer was the title character of a series called Leisure Suit Larry. Larry was a balding, dorky, leisure suit-wearing, but still somewhat lovable middle-aged loser who tried to seduce attractive women.
The tack that I took was to create an anti-hero, a guy who would constantly be humiliated or insulted or put down. But if you played the game long enough, finally in the end he would persevere and have just a short, brief moment of happiness.
Leisure Suit Larry, at the time it came out, that was the first racy content on a computer.
Larry was one of the top 10 games of 1988, proving that games were not just for kids anymore.
Sex sells. I mean, it always has. That's no revelation to anyone. It obviously had an edge to it that was unique on the computer game shelf at that time, certainly.
Another unique aspect of Leisure Suit Larry was that the game was set in a real-world environment with realistic characters. Instead of players exploring fantasy kingdoms like in other adventure games, Larry took players into 21 and over casinos and bars, providing the player with a more adult experience.
I think Larry was the first game to use real characters, real people, and present-day times and present-day settings in situations that seemed like they could come out of today, as opposed to the rut that most games were in, which is either medieval settings or space in the future. I didn't realize that at the time. I had no grand plan. I just knew that I didn't want to compete with those games or with those games, and therefore there was this big hole down the middle that seemed to me to be the perfect spot. And I've been glad to see that develop over the years as a trend in gaming. I think more and more games today are about real people in realistic settings with realistic action.
In order to support these more realistic and explicit game worlds, game companies had to develop new technology. Although Nintendo partnered up with electronic giant Sony to develop CD-ROM technology for its console in the early 90s, contract disputes destroyed the partnership. Instead of working with another game company, Sony decided to continue its research and developed a standalone console on their own, called the Sony PlayStation.
When Sony launched the PlayStation 1, they recognized that, you know what, there's an audience out there of the 18 to 21-year-olds and older that still want to play video games. They grew up playing video games. They still want to play video games, but you know what, now what Nintendo's doing, what Sega's doing, still feels kind of kiddie to them. So Sony kind of filled that void for the older gamers by providing a system that looked a little bit more sophisticated. It was running on CDs, which at the time had this kind of technological advantage where you felt like, boy, you know, I'm getting a hi-fi piece of equipment. I'm not just playing this little kid's toy here.
While Nintendo was still making games on cartridges that could only store 16 megabytes, Sony was making games on CDs that could store 650 megabytes, allowing for more complex graphics and games.
You could have CD quality audio.
Well done, Crash. I knew I could rely on you.
You could have CG quality video. The range of possibility with more space on the storage medium, that increases the possibility for the game.
Sony, to their credit, made video games a much cooler thing to be involved with, to play. We weren't dealing with just kiddie fare anymore. We were dealing with, you know, operatic masterpieces like Final Fantasy VII that really sort of dealt with death and betrayal and issues that certainly seemed more mature. And it opened up our product to so many new people who would now pick up a video game because there were aspects to it that felt like it was relevant to their life.
The PlayStation basically reached the same level of penetration in 10 years that it took the telephone to reach in 30 years. I mean, it just was sort of a sign of how ready people were to have something like this in their lives. It also brought us into this time where more adult fare was being produced.
From 1994 to 97, nearly 16 million PlayStation units found their place next to people's home stereos and VCRs around the world.
The PlayStation came along in a time where the consoles moved into a world where you really had a 3D environment for the games. So Tomb Raider and Lara Croft and these, you know, very complex environments where you could explore, that was a real hallmark of the PlayStation, and at the time it really blew people's minds.
Another PlayStation game that blew people's minds was Grand Theft Auto 3, where the hero no longer saved the princess, but rather the hero saved himself, even if it meant breaking the law.
You've got a handful of goals you're trying to achieve, but what's changed is the play space. So they layer another fiction on top of it. So rather than being a slightly overweight plumber like Mario or a faceless spaceship in Asteroids, you know, you're Carl Johnson, or you're a gangster who just got out of prison, and you know, you're looking to get your life back together. And for today's audience, you know, sort of the post-Gen X audience, post-Oliver North, post-Gulf War audience, you know, that's something they can relate to more than some of the traditional heroic fictions of generations past.
We're looking at a very tech-savvy consumer that can multitask, that wants interaction, that wants personalized experiences, doesn't want to be told what to watch, what to listen to, but wants it on his or her own terms. And that's what games deliver.
In the Grand Theft Auto games, players choose to be the criminal, just like in real life.
Grand Theft Auto is a game that allows for morally the players to make different choices, and they're not necessarily always going to be the choices we would like them to make.
One of my girls needs a ride, so grab a car
and pick up Misty from the clinic, then bring her back here.
The fact that you could do something that is wrong and yet get some kind of reward in the game for doing it. In the same way that in real life, somebody could burgle your house, which is clearly wrong, and yet make some money from the goods they stole, which is clearly good in their eyes. That's real life, and there are some games now that are kind of presenting those same conundrums to people. And it's interesting that people look at that and go, oh my God, that's horrible that they even allow you to make the same choices in the game that you can make in real life.
You're unleashed into this game world and you can try out the cars, you can try out how different they feel, and then you're like, what if I drive it off the bridge? Like, oh, it blows up, okay, let me drive it a little faster. And you try all these cool things that you wouldn't be able to do in real life and hopefully aren't doing in real life.
When the PlayStation 2 was released, the third edition of the Grand Theft Auto series unexpectedly emerged as the smash hit of 2001. Jumping for coins was out, jumping innocent bystanders was in.
Grand Theft Auto 3 and its sequels really kicked off this movement of games that were becoming more Hollywood-like. You know, these are games that kind of told about the life of crime, like you see in so many movies like Goodfellas or shows like The Sopranos. And it had this incredible all-star cast that Rockstar, the developer, didn't even hype up. They didn't even want to take advantage of. They just wanted to have this really awesome cast. You know, people like Samuel L. Jackson.
I'll take that, Hernandez.
Hey, that's my paper, man. That's money.
This is drug money.
And all these great names are just kind of behind the scenes doing this video game. And it also was cinematic because it told a story where you got to see your character just start out as maybe a small-time thug and slowly moving up the ranks, gaining more respect of his peers and fighting other crime bosses. So it had a real Hollywood kind of cinematic presentation to it, but at the same time, was a pure video game.
The Grand Theft Auto series, created by Rockstar Games, started a trend in games that now had movie-worthy storylines, high-quality voice acting done by real Hollywood stars, and even music soundtracks.
Here in my car, I feel safest of all. I can lock on my doors. It's the only way to live.
In Grand Theft Auto, one of the cool things was you had a radio station, and the radio station you could tune in, and there were all these great songs from the 80s that gave the game a real mood.
Rockstar would, use, pop songs, and they'd get really talented voiceover. They'd write the dialogue in a short, punchy way that just sort of worked. So they didn't get trapped in sort of the Final Fantasy approach of these long, attenuated cutscenes. It's very short, in and out, and use the other things besides the visuals to help bring the world to life.
I really think this shows that gaming culture is becoming much more of a mainstream culture, and lots of other kinds of media are interested in getting some of the passion that gamers have and capitalizing on it.
Video games were looking and sounding more like movies, and finally starting to get the respect from Hollywood that they deserved.
When you look at games that are action-adventure type games that have these incredibly lush environments, and that from 2D to 3D to HD has all happened within a decade, and really has propelled video games to now part of Hollywood when we think of the experiences you're delivering, the licenses that Hollywood movie studios are now very eager to get into the video game business, and the impact that we have overall in the world of entertainment. We are really focusing on driving a 20 to 40 hour interaction with a 25-year-old male that's no longer watching television, they're playing television.
This sense of participation and heroism that you get out of winning a video game is much more powerful than you get from watching some character in a movie be heroic or victorious.
I think up until recently, it was we as an industry were licensing movie rights and then paying a large amount of money at times to then do the game version of a particular movie as it was either being released or maybe 3 or 4 months later. Hollywood now recognizes that that male consumer is not going to the theater. They're at home, they have their high-definition TV screen, they're connected to millions of people through Xbox Live, and now I think the shoe is on the other foot.
Video games are becoming more mainstream with in-depth storylines, complex characters, and realistic graphics. But unlike Hollywood, good looks in video games can only go so far. At the dawn of the 21st century, the days of playing a little man with an oversized moustache were over. New consoles like the Sony PlayStation revolutionized the industry.
The computational power that you have today in modern consoles, be it the PlayStation or the Xbox, is several orders of magnitude more powerful than what we had in the first video game consoles, like with the Pong machine. Or it's really like comparing the level of technology embodied in a modern skyscraper to Stonehenge.
I remember, and a lot of people remember, playing called Tecmo Bowl from the game publisher Tecmo. And it was a very compelling game, but it wasn't exactly high-tech from the point of view of the way it looked and felt. And it really didn't look like an NFL game. Fast forward to where we are today, we're now looking at games, in particular EA's Madden Football, that if you walk past the screen in the living room and you're not paying attention, as far as you're concerned, there's a real NFL game going on there.
Live from Foxborough.
The detailed, high-fidelity graphics allowed players to become real sports heroes. Regardless of a gamer's physical skills, they could master any sport, virtually.
The new sports games give players a sense of power over, their heroes, because all of a sudden you have all these players' faces and their names, and it's all real, and the rosters are all there. So they can almost move these guys around like, toy soldiers on a battlefield. And, that's a pretty heady experience.
Picked off by the linebacker.
For many years now, Electronic Arts has had this slogan about EA Sports: if it's in the game, it's in the game. Where that really originated was with my passion for authenticity.
In order to get the video game characters to move like real athletes, game developers used motion capture, a technological method they borrowed from Hollywood.
Motion capture is a process by which you put markers on a person, and then you capture their movement data, and that gives you the ability to get very realistic, gross joint motion. One of the things you see in real life basketball is that any one move, everyone on the court reacts to it in some way. And EA said, well, we're going to try and take advantage of that. So they actually motion captured 10 players at a time on the court, in addition to the individual motion capture sessions they were doing. And so when you play the game, you saw it. It made a big difference. You made one little move, and everyone responded to it in some way, shape, or form. So, it puts you in the game more.
Now you have so much computing power rendering these environments that you have something that's almost like hyper-realistic. And, you can see the players' eyeballs, and, you can't even see those things, when you're watching real sports events on TV.
However, by trying to create more lifelike graphics in video games, sports heroes actually started looking more dead than alive, in what technologists called the uncanny valley. A term to describe the repulsive response a human has to a robot's almost human or uncanny looks.
It's like the difference between a living body and a cadaver. It's the difference between a mannequin and a human being. That the more it looks like a human, the more that gap just sort of moves forward, and we still say it looks plastic, it looks mechanical, it doesn't look real. You don't have that problem of looking at a cartoon and say that's creepy, it doesn't look real. But the closer you get to being realistic, the more they realize that's still like a living doll, it's not like a human being.
Without emotion, even the most realistic-looking characters couldn't provide the player with an authentic human experience.
If you can't communicate with characters in only a very shallow way, how are we going to care very much about them? We're going to have no problem just killing them and running them over with our virtual cars. But once we can speak in our own words and they can really hear us, and there's an actual conversation going on, then we are going to start feeling more emotional, and we may get to the point of tears when we interact with them.
The gold standard has become whether a game can make you cry, and some people think it can't, and there's no games make you cry except when you can't get it to work. Others think that games are already making us cry on a regular basis, but crying becomes emblematic of capturing the human experience. It's about broadening the range of what a game can do, what kinds of worlds it can bring into our living rooms.
In the early days, we had a hard time showing human beings, so games were about aliens from outer space. But then we figured out how to show humans on the screen, and you started to get more games about human beings. Now the holy grail is kind of emotion, characters that feel fully fleshed out and like real human beings. That's really the next challenge for us.
Until then, perhaps the rendering doesn't always have to happen on the screen. It can happen in the imagination of the player, where it did with the first low-resolution graphics or text-based adventure games. Whether or not a game makes the player cry, a video game is still a powerful medium. After all, where else can someone with the push of a button become a hero?